Welcome to Sleeping Times. Have you ever stopped to think about what it was like to celebrate Christmas when winter was truly dangerous, when light was a rare luxury, when you were not sure if you would survive until spring? While you were lying in the safety of your warm bed prepared for sleep, let us travel 7 centuries back and experience a Christmas that was profoundly different from ours, a Christmas where every lit candle was a challenge to the dark, where every meal was a miracle of abundance, and where ancient traditions mixed with Christian faith in ways that would surprise us today. You will discover that some of the things we still do at Christmas have roots far older and far more meaningful than you ever imagined. And more importantly, you will understand why, even 7 centuries later, we still need this holiday so desperately. If you want to learn history while you relax, subscribe now for stories like this every week. And don't forget to leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from and what time it is there. It is always incredible to see how our community is spread across the world. Now, how about turning the lights, finding a comfortable position, and preparing to dive into medieval banquets, into fireplaces that warmed castles, into stories told by candlelight, and into forgotten rituals that shape the way we celebrate even today. Imagine waking up on a December morning in the year 1320 somewhere in medieval Europe. There are no digital alarms, no notifications flashing on a screen. What awakens you is the distant sound of church bells echoing through the icy fog, traveling across fields covered in frost, reverberating between stone and wooden structures. The air inside the room is so cold that you can see your own breath forming small clouds in front of your face. The stone walls, thick enough to repel invaders, also trap the night's cold as if they were blocks of ice. There is no central heating, no thermostat to adjust. There is only you, your family, and the promise that somewhere in the house, a fireplace must already be coming back to life. This is the reality of medieval Christmas, a celebration that was born not from comfort, but from the human need to find light in the darkest part of the year. The winter solstice had just passed, and although the days were slowly beginning to lengthen, the harshest cold was still to come. For people of that time, Christmas was not merely a religious date or an opportunity for consumption. It was an act of resistance against winter, a collective declaration that, even when nature seemed dead and the world frozen, humanity could create warmth, abundance, and hope. Think for a moment. When was the last time you really felt cold? Not that inconvenient cold when the air conditioning is turned up too high, but that cold that penetrates your bones, that makes your fingers ache, that transforms every movement into a conscious effort. For our medieval ancestors, that cold was the constant companion of winter months. And Christmas, with its elaborate celebrations, its feasts, and its traditions, was the cultural response to this hostility of nature. It was a way of saying, we are still here, we can still celebrate, we still have reasons to live. Preparations for medieval Christmas began weeks in advance, sometimes even months. It was not about ordering gifts over the internet with express delivery or decorating the house in a weekend. It was about planned survival transformed into sacred ritual. Animals were slaughtered at the beginning of winter, because feeding them during the barren months would be impossible for most families. The meat had to be salted, smoked, cured. This process, which seems primitive to us, was actually a sophisticated preservation technology refined over centuries. And part of this precious meat, carefully stored, would be reserved for the great celebration. The concept of holiday season had a completely different meaning in medieval Europe. It was not just a few days off from work. It was a period that extended for 12 complete days, from which the expression, the 12 days of Christmas, still familiar in the United States, is derived. 12 days of relative relief from hard labor, 12 days when rigid social rules loosened slightly, 12 days when even serfs could expect some special treatment from their lords. It was a time when feudal society, normally as stratified as ice forms in layers, allowed small cracks of shared humanity. But there was also a profound spiritual dimension that our secular age sometimes forgets. For medieval Christians, Christmas was not about the historical birth of Jesus. It was about the ongoing miracle of divine incarnation. It was about the radical idea that the divine had chosen to become human, vulnerable, subject to cold and hunger and all the indignities of mortal existence. In an age when life was brutally short and death a constant presence, this promise that God himself understood human suffering offered a comfort that no feast or decoration could provide alone. The Catholic Church, which completely dominated the spiritual and cultural life of medieval Europe, had strategically overlaid Christmas onto ancient pagan celebrations of the winter solstice. It was no coincidence that this date fell exactly when the ancient Romans celebrated Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, or when Germanic and Nordic peoples held their Yule festivals. The Church was pragmatic. It was easier to Christianize existing traditions than to eradicate them completely. Thus, holly and ivy, plants sacred to the Druids because they remained green when everything else died, were incorporated into Christian iconography as symbols of the eternal life promised by Christ. This fusion between the pagan and the Christian created a celebration extraordinarily rich in layers of meaning. When medieval families decorated their homes with green branches, they were simultaneously honoring ancestral traditions of their pre-Christian ancestors and celebrating the Christian promise of resurrection. When they lit candles and fires, they were both driving away the evil spirits of pagan winter and illuminating the path to the newborn Christ. This ambiguity did not trouble people of that time. On the contrary, it enriched the experience, gave it multiple resonances. Have you ever stopped to think about how many of our modern Christmas traditions are actually echoes of these medieval and pre-Christian rituals? The Christmas tree, for example, has direct roots in Germanic practices of venerating sacred trees and bringing evergreen branches into homes during winter. The habit of giving gifts traces back not only to the Christian Magi but also to Roman Saturnalia, when gifts were exchanged as symbols of good fortune for the coming year. Even the modern Santa Claus is a complex amalgamation, part Christian Saint Nicholas, part pagan nature spirits that brought gifts or tricks during the solstice. But let us return to that cold December morning of 1320. As the bells continue to ring, calling the faithful to dawn mass, smoke begins to rise from chimneys throughout the village or town. Each column of smoke represents a family waking up, lighting their fire, preparing not just for another day of winter, but for the most special day of the year. The streets, normally muddy and unpleasant, may be covered with fresh snow, temporarily transformed into something clean and almost magical. Children, wrapped in every layer of clothing their families possess, already begin to gather, their faces red from the cold, eyes bright with anticipation. In the great cities, in the castles of nobles and in wealthy abbeys, the preparations are even more elaborate. Servants work from before dawn, carrying wood, preparing the immense stone ovens, arranging the huge tables that on this special day will be laden with more food than most people see in an entire month. There is a peculiar energy in the air, part excitement, part exhaustion, part that nervous joy that comes from knowing something extraordinary is about to happen, even if that extraordinary has been achieved through weeks of hard work. In the castle kitchens, the smell is already intoxicating. Rare spices brought from distant lands through dangerous trade routes are being used with a generous hand. Today is not a day to economize. Cinnamon from Asia, pepper from India, saffron from the Mediterranean, ginger from places so remote that few could locate them on a map. These spices are not merely flavors, they are symbols of status, demonstrations of wealth, tangible connections to a world much larger than most people will ever see. For peasants, even a small taste of these exotic delicacies at Christmas is a luxury almost unimaginable for the rest of the year. Compare this to our modern Christmas, especially in the United States. How many of us actually spend weeks actively preparing the celebration? How many of us really feel that we are creating something special from scratch, using resources carefully accumulated and preserved? Our abundance is so guaranteed, so accessible through 24-hour supermarkets, that we lose that sense of anticipation built through collective effort. I am not romanticizing the harshness of those times. Certainly it is better to have heating and food security. But in eliminating the difficulty, did we not also eliminate part of the meaning? And what about community connection? In the medieval world, it was impossible to celebrate Christmas alone. You depended on your community for everything, from physical safety to emotional comfort, from food production to the creation of joy. Christmas was, by necessity, a collective celebration. Today, how many of us celebrate in isolation, perhaps with only the artificial light of television as company? Technology has given us freedom and independence, but has it not also stolen something essential about what it means to be human during the darkest season of the year? As the sun finally begins to rise over that medieval Christmas morning, a weak, pale sunrise that barely manages to warm the icy air, people begin their journey toward the church. And it is in this journey, in this collective movement toward a shared purpose, that our story of medieval Christmas truly begins. Because what will happen in the coming hours and days is not merely a religious celebration or a secular feast. It is something much deeper. It is the annual affirmation that even in the most adverse conditions, the human spirit can find reasons to celebrate, to give thanks, and to hope. The path to the church on that medieval Christmas morning was not simply a matter of walking a few blocks. For many, it meant crossing frozen fields, following trails covered in snow that blended with the surrounding terrain, passing through forests where the silence was so dense that each step crunched far too loudly. There was no public lighting, a concept that would not emerge for centuries to come. There was only the growing light of dawn, torches carried by a few lucky ones who had wax or resin to burn, and the strange luminosity that snow reflects even in twilight. Families walked together not merely for companionship, but for safety. Medieval winter was dangerous in ways we rarely consider today. Wolves, for example, were not merely characters from fairy tales. They were real threats, especially during harsh winters, when hunger drove them close to human settlements. There are historical records of packs attacking solitary travelers, of farms having to defend their livestock at night, of children being warned never, ever to stray from populated areas after nightfall. Medieval Christmas happened despite these dangers, not in their absence. And when people finally reached the safety of the church, that sacred space represented not merely spiritual salvation, but literal physical refuge against a hostile world outside. The church itself was probably the most impressive building that most people would ever enter in their entire lives. While common homes were low structures of wood and clay, with thatched roofs and minimal windows, the church rose in majestic stone. Gothic, if we were in more prosperous areas of France or England, Romanesque if we were in older or more conservative regions. The contrast was deliberate. The church wanted you to feel small, humble, amazed. It wanted the sacred space to seem qualitatively different from the profane world where you spent your days. And it worked. For a peasant living in a one-room hut, entering the nave of a cathedral must have been like a modern astronaut feeling weightlessness for the first time, disorienting, sublime, transformative, Imagine the sensory experience. You step out of the biting cold and enter a space that, although also cold, medieval churches were not heated, feels different because of the number of human bodies gathered there. The air changes, you smell incense, a complex, resinous fragrance that the church imported at great cost from the Middle East because the smell of incense ascending was understood as a metaphor for prayers rising up to God. You hear Gregorian chant, those hypnotic, melismatic melodies that seem to exist outside normal time, without the regular rhythmic pulse of secular music. You see, and this was perhaps the most striking aspect, colored light. The stained glass windows of medieval churches were not merely decorative. They were applied theology, Bibles for the illiterate, cutting-edge technology of a pre-printing era for communicating complex stories and doctrines. Sunlight, passing through laboriously created colored glass by specialized craftsmen, projected kaleidoscopic patterns onto the stone walls and onto the faithful themselves. Deep blues and vibrant reds, colors that most people rarely saw in their daily lives, dominated by browns, grays, and the faded green of nature. At Christmas, when the winter sun was at its lowest angle, the light had a special quality, almost horizontal, that made the stained glass glow with particular intensity. The medieval Christmas Mass was a lengthy affair. We are not talking about a polite hour. We are talking about 3, 4, sometimes 5 hours of complex liturgical ritual, almost entirely in Latin, a language that the vast majority of those present did not understand. But understanding in the intellectual sense was not really the point. The point was to participate in a mystery, to immerse yourself in something greater than yourself, to allow the ritual to carry you like a current. There was an almost meditative quality to it, especially considering that these same people worked physically from dawn to dusk on every other day of the year. To stand or kneel, merely listening and observing for hours, was in itself a form of rest. Can you imagine our modern society tolerating this? We, who compulsively check our phones, who consider a 30-second commercial an unbearable interruption, who consume entertainment in carefully timed episodes to fit our fragmented attention spans. The patience of medieval people, or would it be resignation? For long and repetitive rituals reveals something profound about how they experience time differently. Time was not measured in precise increments of minutes and seconds. It was measured in church bells marking the canonical hours, in agricultural seasons, in cycles of birth and death. A 5-hour Mass on the most important day of the year did not seem like a waste. It seemed appropriate. During the Mass, specific moments stood out with special significance. The elevation of the host, when the priest lifted the consecrated bread that, according to the doctrine of transubstantiation, literally became the body of Christ, was a moment of absolute silence and total reverence. Bells rang. People prostrated themselves. It was sincerely believed, the moment when the divine penetrated the material, when the impossible happened right before your eyes. For an age that had few obvious miracles of technology, few manufactured moments of wonder, this ritual offered something profoundly powerful, the promise that the supernatural was accessible, present, real. There were also, interspersed among the solemn moments, elements of almost wild joy. Certain medieval Christmas hymns were surprisingly upbeat, almost dance-like. There are records of original Christmas carols, which were not the sentimental, melodious songs we know today, but circular dances accompanied by singing, sometimes performed inside the church itself, despite the periodic objections of stricter clergy. The line between the sacred and the profane was more porous than our desacralized age sometimes imagines. Medieval Christmas could be reverent and noisy, sacred and sensual, all at the same time. And then there were the nativity scenes, representations of the birth of Christ. Although elaborate home nativity sets were a later development, medieval churches often created scenes of the nativity using sculptures or even real people. St. Francis of Assisi is credited with popularizing the tradition of using live animals and people enacting the scene in Bethlehem. Imagine the experience. You are in this space of cold stone, majestic, seemingly so distant from the everyday world, and suddenly there is a cow, a donkey, a real baby representing Jesus. The exotic and the familiar colliding, the transcendent made tangible. It was mystery play in the most literal sense. Theatre, designed to communicate spiritual mysteries to a largely illiterate audience. Compare that immersive, multisensory, hours-long experience to how many modern Americans experience religious Christmas. For many, it is an hour on Christmas Eve or Christmas morning, often as much a social obligation as an act of faith, conducted in churches with central heating and comfortable seating, with the sermon carefully timed, not to exceed 15 minutes, so people do not become impatient. We have gained in comfort and efficiency, but have we lost something of the intensity, that feeling of participating in something so important that it deserves hours of your total attention? There is also a communal dimension worth highlighting. In the medieval Christmas church, you were literally standing beside your entire community. The local feudal lord might have a more privileged seat, it is true. Social hierarchy did not disappear completely, but everyone was there, breathing the same cold air, hearing the same incomprehensible Latin, seeing the same light filtered through the same stained glass. There was a leveling, even if temporary. Christmas was one of the few moments when the Christian ideology that all are equal before God had some physical manifestation, however imperfect. Today, how many of us truly know everyone in our community? How many of us share collective experiences with people outside our chosen socio-economic or ideological bubble? When the Mass finally ended, and you must remember people had been standing or kneeling for most of that time, there were no comfortable pews in the older churches, there was a palpable transformation. The solemn, heavy, penitential part of the day was complete. The religious obligation had been fulfilled. Now, finally, the celebration could begin. People emerged from the church, blinking against the daylight, now stronger, though still weak by winter standards. Their bodies stiffened by cold and prolonged immobility, but their spirits lifted. There were conversations, laughter, the kind of effusiveness that comes from relief. And everyone turned to the same thought: food. But medieval Christmas food was not simply a matter of sitting down for a meal. It was an event, a theatre, a demonstration of wealth or aspiration, an affirmation of continuity and abundance in the midst of a world of scarcity. And it was toward this culinary celebration, so different from anything we know today, that everyone now turned with growing anticipation. What would they eat? How would it be prepared? Who would be invited to share? And what ancient traditions, some Christian, some far older than Christianity, would be observed as they ate? Food at medieval Christmas was not merely sustenance. It was political statement, religious demonstration, social spectacle, and for many, the only time in the entire year when they would experience something close to abundance. To understand the medieval Christmas feast, you first need to understand medieval hunger, not acute crisis hunger, although that existed regularly, but the chronic and persistent hunger that was simply the standard condition for most people. The typical diet of a medieval peasant consisted mainly of grain porridge, dark and dense bread, cooked vegetables, and occasionally cheese or eggs. Meat was rare. Spices were almost unattainable luxuries. Against this backdrop of dietary monotony, Christmas represented an explosion of flavor and variety that is difficult for us, living in an age of globalized supermarkets, to truly appreciate. Let us start with meat. specifically with animals that would seem surprising or even repugnant to us in a festive context today. Swans, for example, were considered a high-status delicacy, not merely because they were beautiful and rare, but because their white meat was associated with purity and therefore appropriate for a religious celebration. Peacocks were even more prestigious, and there are records of peacocks being carefully plucked, roasted, and then readorned with their own brilliant feathers before being presented to the table, creating the illusion that the bird was still alive. This was not merely cooking, it was artistic performance, a demonstration that the host had not only resources, but also the cultural refinement to present them spectacularly. For those less wealthy, who still had means above the average peasant, pork was the star. Pigs were practical animals. They ate practically anything, could be raised in small spaces, and crucially, almost every part of the animal was usable. At Christmas, an entire pig could be roasted, often with an apple in its mouth, a tradition that persists in some celebrations even today. The pig's head, in particular, was considered a special delicacy. Can you imagine serving an entire pig's head, with eyes and all, as the centerpiece of a modern American Christmas dinner? And yet, for medieval people, this was not morbid or grotesque, it was honest. It was acknowledging that meat comes from animals, that eating requires death, that life continues because other lives end. Wild boars were valued even more highly than domestic pigs, but obtaining them required hunting. And hunting was not merely a matter of going out with a rifle. It was dangerous, time-consuming, and in many areas legally restricted. Medieval hunting laws were notoriously severe. Entire forests were declared royal properties, where only nobility could hunt, and peasants caught hunting illegally could face mutilation or death. This created a peculiar situation where game meat became not merely food, but a symbol of social power. Serving venison or wild boar at Christmas communicated unequivocally, "I have access to resources you do not. I operate in a sphere of privilege." It was delicious, certainly, but it was also propaganda. And then there were fish. This may surprise you, considering that Christmas is a feast, not a day of fasting. But medieval Catholic theology had complex rules about when to eat meat versus fish, and many meals included both to cover all theological bases. Moreover, in an age without refrigeration, fresh fish in winter was a genuine luxury, especially for inland communities. Pike, carp, eels, sturgeon. Some kept alive in special ponds until needed. Eel, in particular, was extremely popular, despite being something many modern Americans would consider repulsive. Eels were prepared in dozens of ways: eel pies, roasted eels, eels in jelly. They were accessible protein and rich flavor, all in a slippery package, but meat and fish were merely the beginning. What really distinguished a medieval feast were the spices: pepper, cinnamon, ginger, saffron, cloves, nutmeg, cardamom. These substances were literally worth their weight in gold. They were transported along trade routes that crossed continents, passing from intermediary to intermediary, each adding their margin, until they arrived in Europe at astronomical prices. Why would anyone spend so much on seasonings? Part of it was preservation. Spices had antimicrobial properties that helped meat last longer. Part of it was medicine. Medieval humoral theory prescribed specific spices to balance health, but mainly, let us be honest, it was ostentation. Using spices generously demonstrated wealth in a way that nothing else could. Compare this to our modern relationship with spices. You can go to any supermarket in the United States and buy cinnamon, ginger, cloves, all the spices that would make a medieval noble salivate for a few dollars. They come in standardized plastic bottles, often sitting in our cupboards for months, used casually or forgotten entirely. We have completely lost the sense that these were precious substances, tangible connections to exotic lands, items for which wars were fought and fortunes risked. Our abundance has killed our sense of wonder. When everything is available all the time, nothing seems special. Medieval people, with their scarcity, knew how to value the extraordinary. The beverages of the Christmas feast were as important as the food. Wine, where grapes could grow, but more commonly beer or mead in northern regions. These were not the refined and consistent beverages we know today. Medieval beer was murky, full of sediment, varied wildly in quality and strength from one batch to another. But it was safe to drink, unlike water, which was often contaminated. And at Christmas there were special beverages. Wassail, a word that comes from Old Norse veshael, meaning be healthy, was a hot punch of beer or cider seasoned with spices, sometimes with beaten eggs, served in a large communal bowl from which everyone drank. Passing the wassail bowl was not merely hospitality, it was ritual, linking each drinker to the next in a liquid chain of community. There was also hippocras, heated wine sweetened with honey and heavily spiced, named in honor of Hippocrates because it was believed to have medicinal properties. After hours in the cold, after a long mass in an unheated church, a cup of hot hippocras must have been like liquid balm, spreading warmth from the stomach to the extremities. And the alcohol, of course, helped loosen tongues and inhibitions, transforming a formal dinner into a true celebration. Medieval people did not have our modern anxieties about responsible alcohol consumption. Getting drunk at festivals was not merely acceptable, but practically expected. Christmas was one of the few times when such drunkenness was sanctioned, even for the lower classes. And then there was bread, which seemed simple, but was not. The type of bread you ate was as clear a marker of social status as the clothes you wore. White bread, made from finely sifted wheat flour, was for nobility. The middle class ate wheat and rye mixed bread. The poor ate dark bread made from rye, barley, or even ground peas and beans when grains were scarce. At Christmas, however, even modest families tried to serve bread slightly better than usual, perhaps with dried fruit mixed in or molded into special shapes. There were special Christmas breads, such as the German Christstollen, a precursor to what we know today, dense with dried fruits and nuts, or spice cakes that were more confectionery than bread proper. Desserts, as a distinct category, were a somewhat different concept in the medieval period. Sweet and savory dishes were often served together, and sugar was so rare and expensive that it was considered a spice, used medicinally in tiny quantities. Honey was the primary sweetener, and desserts were often dried fruits, figs, dates, raisins, or nuts. There are records of subtleties, elaborate and edible sculptures made from almond paste, sugar for the very wealthy, and natural dyes molded into religious or heraldic shapes. These were not primarily meant to be eaten, they were meant to impress, to demonstrate resources and artistic skill. Imagine spending months creating an intricate sugar sculpture only to see it admired and then consumed in minutes. It was ephemeral art elevated to its extreme. The presentation of food was highly theatrical. Dishes were not simply brought and placed on the table. They were announced, sometimes with trumpet fanfares, carried ceremonially by servants in procession. There was a prescribed order for service that reflected social hierarchy. The lord and important guests received the best portions first, the less important received what was left over. The main table in a great hall would be elevated on a platform, literally and figuratively above the other diners. Eating was not merely consumption of calories, it was a performance of power. And everyone present understood and accepted their role in this hierarchy, at least ostensibly. Resentment, of course, simmered beneath the surface, occasionally erupting in rebellions that the elite would calm with temporary concessions. Think about how this contrasts with modern American Christmas meals. Certainly, there are still elements of tradition and ritual. The turkey, the ham, specific dishes we always make. But there is far less conscious theatre, far less explicit hierarchical demonstration. We eat in nuclear families or small groups of friends, not in great halls with the entire community present. Our meals are abundant, but that abundance is so routine that we barely register it. We may have a greater variety of foods than any medieval noble could dream of, but how many of us truly savor that variety, truly stop to appreciate the extraordinary global logistics that place fresh fruits from 3 continents on our Christmas table? Our abundance has made us numb. And yet, is there not something in us that yearns for that intensity of appreciation that scarcity created? When each taste of cinnamon is precious because cinnamon is rare, the flavor means more. When eating meat is exceptional rather than routine, the taste of meat becomes transcendent. Perhaps that is why modern food movements, slow food, farm to table, seasonal eating, resonate so much with certain audiences. They are trying artificially to recreate the conditions of scarcity and intentionality that were simply the reality for our ancestors. We are trying to return, through choice and philosophy, to something they had by necessity. As the medieval Christmas feast continued, and continue is the right word, because these meals lasted hours, sometimes extending for an entire day, something more was happening beyond mere eating. Stories were being told, social alliances were being reinforced, the fabric of community was being repaired and renewed. The food was the medium, but the true purpose was something deeper. The confirmation that despite all difficulties, despite the cold and darkness and the ever-present threat of hunger, they were still alive, still together, still had reasons to celebrate. And when finally the plates were cleared and the tables partially cleaned, the next phase of the celebration began, a phase that would surprise us even more than the food. After the banquet tables were partially cleared, and note that partially is the right word, because food was purposefully left to be consumed later, to be distributed to the poor, to demonstrate that there was so much it could not be consumed all at once. A phase of the Christmas celebration began that most of us, with our modern conceptions of religious reverence, would find deeply surprising. Medieval Christmas, especially in the days following Christmas Day itself, was a time of deliberate social inversion, of controlled chaos, of traditions that came from places far older than Christianity. It was when servants could mock their lords, when children commanded adults, when the sacred and profane danced together in ways that would make later religious reformers shudder in horror. Let us talk about the Lord of Misrule, the Lord of Disorder. This was a tradition that had direct roots in Roman Saturnalia, those winter festivals where slaves temporarily exchanged places with masters, where social order was turned upside down for a few precious days. In the medieval Christian version, a Lord of Misrule would be chosen, sometimes by lottery, sometimes by acclamation, to preside over the Christmas festivities. This person, who could be a servant or low-ranking member of the household, had temporary authority to command even his social superiors in games, dances, and amusements. It was sanctioned transgression, theatrical revolution, that reinforced the established order precisely by allowing its temporary violation. Think about the astute psychology of this. If you are a servant who spends the entire year obeying orders, being treated as inferior, having your labor exploited by those above you in the feudal hierarchy, how do you prevent that resentment from simmering and turning into genuine rebellion? One answer is to provide a pressure valve, a few days each year where you can, in limited and controlled ways, mock that authority, invert those relationships, be the Lord, even if only in jest. After those days end, normal order is restored, but you have released some pressure. It is brilliant social manipulation disguised as generous festivity. And yet, for those who lived it, the feelings must have been genuine. The joy of commanding your lord, even if only to choose the next game, was real. The games themselves were often loud, physical, sometimes violent. Snapdragon, a game where raisins soaked in brandy were placed in fire and participants had to snatch them from the flames with bare hands, quickly putting them in their mouths to extinguish the flames. Today this would be considered incredibly dangerous, a violation of numerous safety codes. For medieval people, it was exciting fun, a demonstration of courage, a way to add adrenaline to a feast. There were games of dice, card games where they existed, chasing and capturing games that spread throughout entire halls. The seriousness and solemnity of the morning mass had given way to something almost Dionysian. Music and dance were central to these celebrations. But we are not talking about the sentimental and melodious Christmas songs that play incessantly in American shopping centers from November through December. Original carols were circular dance songs, often with repetitive refrains that allowed even the musically untrained to participate. Some had explicitly religious lyrics, it is true, celebrating the birth of Christ, praising Mary, retelling the nativity story. But others were far more secular, sometimes frankly bawdy, with lyrics about drinking, eating, romance, and everything that comes with it. The church frequently tried to suppress the most scandalous songs with varying success. People wanted to have fun, and Christmas was their sanctioned moment to do it. Musical instruments were more diverse than you might imagine, flutes and drums certainly, but also bagpipes, which were not merely Scottish, but widely spread throughout medieval Europe. Harps, lutes, hurdy-gurdies, fascinating instruments with strings rubbed by a rotating wheel that produced a buzzing, hypnotic sound. In wealthy households, there might be professional minstrels hired to provide entertainment. These were not merely musicians, they were multifunctional artists who sang, told stories, juggled, sometimes even performed acrobatics. They were the entertainment media of their age, traveling from court to court, bringing news, gossip, and new musical repertoires. Medieval dances were participatory in ways that most modern dances are not. They were not performances to watch, but community activities where everyone was expected to participate. Circular dances where everyone held hands. Line dances where simple movements were repeated, allowing even the unskilled to follow along. And here is something crucial. These dances mixed social classes in ways that normal life strictly forbade. A peasant could, for a few minutes, hold the hand of a merchant's daughter in a dance. A servant could find himself beside his lord in a circle. It was temporary leveling through ritualized movement. And just as with the Lord of Misrule, this temporary leveling probably made permanent inequality more tolerable. Can you see parallels with our era? We think of ourselves as far more egalitarian than feudal society, and in many respects that is true, but we have our own rigid hierarchies of wealth, of status, of education, of race, and we have our own moments of theatrical inversion. Reality shows where ordinary people temporarily become famous, charity events where executives serve food to the homeless for a few hours, political campaigns where millionaire candidates pretend to be people like you. Are these temporary inversions genuinely subversive, or are they, as in medieval Christmas, pressure valves that actually reinforce the established order by making it more bearable? There were also specific traditions involving children that reveal much about how childhood was understood differently in the medieval age. The boy bishop, a tradition where, on December 28th, Holy Innocents' Day, commemorating the children killed by Herod, a choir boy was elected to serve as a symbolic bishop, wearing ecclesiastical vestments, presiding over certain religious services. The real adult bishops temporarily submitted to his ceremonial authority. It was partly educational, teaching the choir boys the ritual and responsibilities of the church, but it also had that element of world inversion. For one day the child commanded the adult, the novice commanded the expert, the humble was exalted. But not everything was innocent joy. The Christmas period was also a time for settling accounts, for reinforcing feudal obligations through ritualized exchanges of gifts. A lord was expected to give gifts, usually food, cloth, sometimes small amounts of money, to his servants and dependents. But these were not gifts in the modern sense of voluntary offerings of affection. They were obligations, part of the feudal social contract where protection and patronage were exchanged for loyalty and service. Accepting a lord's Christmas gift meant acknowledging his authority over you for the coming year. Refusing would be a grave insult, potentially dangerous. So servants accepted their gifts and gave thanks, and the hierarchy was reaffirmed through the act of apparently generous giving. Compare this to our modern Christmas gift exchange, especially in the United States, where it has become a consumer machine of almost absurd proportions. We spend billions of dollars, stress over finding the perfect gift, accumulate credit card debt. But the underlying pressure is similar. Christmas gifts are not really optional. There are social expectations, family obligations, office protocols. Not giving a gift to someone who gave you one creates social debt, embarrassment, possible insult. Just as in the feudal system, modern Christmas gifts often reinforce existing relationships and hierarchies rather than expressing genuine spontaneity. We wrap obligation in decorative paper and pretend it is spontaneity. There were also darker aspects of medieval Christmas that rarely appear in our sanitized versions. Mumming and guising. Traditions where groups of people, often young, would go from house to house in disguise, performing small dramas or songs in exchange for food, drink, or money. It sounds charming, like later Victorian carolers. But these visits sometimes had a coercive element. Denying hospitality to the mummers could result in vandalism, in curses, genuinely believed to be effective, in social ostracism. It was a form of wealth redistribution applied through community pressure. Those who had were socially obligated to share with those who did not, and the threat of repercussions, magical or social, reinforced the obligation. And then there was alcohol, which we have already mentioned in relation to the feast, but which deserves additional emphasis. The medieval Christmas period was, for many people, one of the few times of year when prolonged drunkenness was not merely tolerated, but almost expected. For 12 days, normal restrictions were loosened. People drank from morning until night. This led to joy, certainly. Inhibitions released, tongues loosened, liquid courage to dance and sing, but it also led to violence. Medieval records show spikes in assaults, rapes, and murders during the Christmas period. The same release of social restrictions that allowed fun also allowed violence. The church preached moderation. People often ignored it. Are we really so different? Modern statistics on domestic violence, drunk driving, and other transgressions show similar spikes during the holiday season. We have added new technology, cars, guns, social media, but the underlying human patterns of how celebration, alcohol, elevated emotions, and violence sometimes intertwine remain persistently similar. We like to think we are more civilized than our medieval ancestors, and in many respects we are. But scratch the surface, add alcohol and family stress, and the same shadows appear. As the first day of Christmas transformed into evening and the celebrations finally began to diminish, although only temporarily, for they would resume the next day and continue for the next 11 days. People finally turned to their beds. Exhausted by the long day, the persistent cold, the food and drink, they fell into deep sleep. But even in sleep, Christmas was not over, because what they had celebrated on that first day was merely the beginning of a complex cycle of traditions, rituals, and meanings that would unfold in the days that followed. And among those days, some were stranger, more laden with ancient and mysterious meaning than Christmas Day itself. If you thought medieval Christmas ended on December 25th, you were completely mistaken. Christmas Day was merely the opening of a period that extended for 12 complete days, culminating in Epiphany on January 6th. But these were not simply 12 days of continuous feasting, although there was certainly much of that. They were 12 days when the very fabric of reality seemed thinner, when the spiritual and material worlds drew dangerously close, when strange things could happen. Medieval people called this between time between when normal rules were suspended, and magic, yes, magic, even in an officially Christian society, seemed more possible, more real, more dangerous. Let us start with December 26th, St. Stephen's Day, the first Christian martyr. You might expect his solemn day of reflection on sacrifice and martyrdom, and there were elements of that certainly. But there were also traditions that had absolutely nothing to do with St. Stephen and everything to do with much older beliefs about blood, sacrifice, and the power of the winter solstice. In parts of England and Ireland, this was the day of hunting the wren, a tradition where a small bird, the wren, was hunted and ceremonially killed, and then carried from house to house in procession. Why? Explanations vary, but many point to pre-Christian myths about the wren as a king of birds, whose death symbolized the passing of the old year and the birth of the new. Think about the strangeness of this. Here is a society that declares itself deeply Christian, that has just spent hours in solemn mass celebrating the birth of the Prince of Peace, and now it is ritually killing a small bird and carrying its little body in procession while singing songs. The Church tolerated this, poorly and with frequent objections, because the alternative would be to try to eradicate traditions so deeply rooted in popular culture that removing them could cause revolt. It was safer to superficially Christianize these practices, attributing them some tenuous association with a saint, and hope that, given enough time, the pagan meaning would be forgotten. It rarely worked completely. December 28th was Holy Innocents' Day, commemorating the children killed by Herod in his attempt to kill the baby Jesus. This was traditionally considered a day of bad luck, a day when no new undertaking should be begun, when even kings would postpone coronations or military campaigns. But it was also, paradoxically, a day of pranks and mischief, especially involving children. The already mentioned boy bishop assumed his duties. Children played tricks on adults. There was a carnivalesque, almost hysterical quality to it, as if the commemoration of a horrible infanticide had to be balanced by an exaggerated affirmation of childish joy and liveliness. The psychology is complicated, disturbing even, but profoundly human. And then there was New Year, January the 1st, although it is worth noting that not all parts of medieval Europe used that date as the beginning of the year. Some places began the year on March 25th, Feast of the Annunciation, others on December 25th. The medieval calendar was a glorious mess of competing systems, but wherever January the 1st was observed, it came with its own strange traditions. First footing in Scotland and northern England. The belief that the first person to cross your threshold after midnight would determine your fortune for the entire year. It was preferable that it be a dark-haired man, not blonde. The Viking invaders were blonde, therefore blondes were bad luck, carrying gifts of coal, salt, coin, and bread, representing warmth, flavor, wealth, and food. Everything had symbolic meaning. Everything had to be done exactly right, or you risked the entire coming year. Can you see how these beliefs were fundamentally magical, not Christian? They assumed that specific symbolic actions could causally affect future outcomes through mechanisms not explained by Christian doctrine. The Church would call this superstition at best, witchcraft at worst. But common people saw no contradiction. They went to Mass, received communion, prayed sincerely to God, and then went home and performed rituals that their pagan great-grandparents would have recognized instantly. Popular religiosity was syncretic, pragmatic. Use all available tools to survive in a dangerous world. If Christian prayers and pagan spells could both help, why not use both? During these 12 days, there were widespread beliefs that the dead walked, not zombies in the modern horror sense, but spirits, ghosts of ancestors, sometimes benevolent, sometimes not. There were traditions of leaving food for the dead, of keeping vigils at night, of taking precautions against malevolent spirits. The wild hunt, or the furious host, was a legend spread throughout Europe, a ghostly procession of hunters, sometimes led by Odin in Norse versions, sometimes by Christian figures like Herod, tearing through the winter night sky. Hearing the wild hunt was a terrible omen. Being caught by it could result in death or being dragged to join the ghostly hunters forever. People stayed indoors at night during the 12 days when possible, and those who had to travel made protective prayers and carried amulets. Compare these beliefs with our modern secularism. Most Americans today do not literally believe in ghosts walking during Christmas. Although interestingly, Christmas ghost stories were a popular genre until quite recently, with Dickens' A Christmas Carol being the most famous example. But have we completely exorcised the supernatural from our lives, or have we simply relocated it, transformed it into entertainment, horror movies, TV series about the paranormal, board games about the occult, that we consume voraciously while insisting we do not really believe? There is something in us that yearns for the mysterious, the unexplainable, the terrifying. Medieval people integrated this into their religious and seasonal lives. We segregate it, treat it as fiction, but we keep returning to it repeatedly. Epiphany on January 6th officially marked the end of the Christmas season. This was the day that commemorated the Magi arriving in Bethlehem, although in Eastern Orthodox tradition it is more strongly associated with the baptism of Jesus. There was the king's cake, a special cake baked with a fava bean or small coin hidden inside. Whoever found the object in their slice became the king of the bean, governing the festivities of that day. Again, we see this theme of temporary inversion of fortune. A servant could, by luck, become king for a day. And again, we can ask, was this subversive or reinforcing of the established order? When you allow a servant to play at being king for 24 hours, are you challenging royalty? Or are you making permanent servitude more tolerable by offering this fantastic escape? After Epiphany, life supposedly returned to normal. Decorations were removed, and there were serious superstitions about leaving them longer. It would cause bad luck, invite malevolent spirits. Normal work resumed. The solemnity of Lent was still months away, but the special period of leave ended. The reality of medieval winter life returned. Cold, hard work, monotonous food, the difficult months of January and February, when autumn's stored supplies began to dwindle, but spring was still painfully distant. Christmas, with all its elaborate abundance, had been partly about building physical and psychological reserves to survive those harder months. But something crucial had been accomplished during these 12 days. The community had gathered, shared rituals had been performed, stories had been told and retold, collective identity had been reaffirmed. This may sound abstract, but it was concretely important. In a society without mass communication, without strong national identity, nationalism as we understand it was still centuries away, without much that united people beyond their immediate locality, these shared rituals were literally what created community. Medieval Christmas was not merely about individual celebration or personal spiritual salvation, it was about renewing the social bonds that made collective survival possible. Think about our modern Christmas celebrations through that lens. How many of us truly feel that we are participating in deeply meaningful community rituals? Or is it mainly consumer stress, family obligations, perhaps some religious feeling for those who still practice? We have lost that sense that Christmas fulfills a crucial social function, that it is about weaving and repairing the fabric of community. Or perhaps, and this is a disturbing thought, we simply do not need it the same way because we do not depend on our local communities for survival the way medieval people did. Our welfare state, our supermarkets, our police and firefighters have assumed many functions that communities once performed. We have gained security and lost meaning. Let us step back for a moment to those physical spaces where medieval Christmas happened, because the built environment profoundly shaped the experience. Imagine the great hall of a castle or manor house, the epicenter of Christmas celebrations for the noble class and everyone who depended on it. This was not a space like our modern living rooms designed for intimacy and individual comfort. It was an immense, public, multifunctional space that served as a court, dining hall, meeting room, and for many of the servants, even a dormitory. During Christmas, this space was transformed through elaborate decoration that was not merely aesthetic, it was survival technology. The bare stone walls of a medieval castle were magnificently impressive, but also brutally cold. Stone absorbs cold and radiates it back. So during winter, especially during Christmas, tapestries were hung, not merely for beauty, although they were often elaborate works of art depicting biblical scenes, chivalric epics, or hunts. They created a layer of air between the freezing stone and the habitable space, functioning as primitive but surprisingly effective insulation. Medieval tapestries were massive investments. They took months or years to weave, used expensive materials, required highly skilled craftsmen, but they were not frivolous luxury. They were practical necessity elevated to the form of art. The floor also received special treatment. Normally, it might be simply stone or packed earth covered with straw or rushes that were changed periodically. But for Christmas, aromatic herbs were mixed into the straw. Rosemary, lavender, sweet herbs that released fragrance when stepped upon. This served multiple purposes. It disguised odors. Remember, regular bathing was not a thing, and all those bodies gathered in enclosed space created considerable aroma. It had presumed medicinal properties warding off disease, and it created a distinct sensory experience that marked the space as special, different from the everyday. Every time you took a step, you released a small waft of fragrance. It was medieval aromatherapy, intuitive sensory design. And then there was the fireplace. Oh, the fireplace. This was not a decorative element. It was literally the heart of the house, the difference between life and death during the European winter. Medieval fireplaces in great halls were immense, some large enough for a person to stand inside. The Yule log, or the Christmas log, was not a small, decorative piece of wood. It was an enormous tree trunk, the largest that could be found and dragged inside, selected specifically to burn slowly and continuously throughout all 12 days of Christmas. Keeping this log burning was serious responsibility. There were superstitions that if it went out, it would bring bad luck. So someone had the task of feeding it constantly, ensuring that the flames never died completely. The light the fireplace provided was as important as its heat. Remember, this was an age before electricity, before even efficient methods of illumination with candles or oil. Night was genuinely dark in ways we rarely experience in our modern artificially lit world. A moonless night in medieval winter was near total darkness, oppressive, disorienting. So fire was not merely physical comfort, it was psychological balm against the dark void of winter. Gathering around the fireplace at Christmas was gathering around the literal source of light and life. No wonder fire acquired such profound symbolic meanings in so many cultures. Candles were used, but they were expensive. Beeswax candles were the privilege of the wealthy. They burned cleaner, smelled better. The less fortunate used tallow candles made from animal fat, which smelled terrible when burned and produced black smoke. Even so, for Christmas, an effort was made to have more light than normal. Churches would be illuminated with dozens or hundreds of candles for Christmas services. The effect, in a world normally so dark, must have been dazzling, almost supernatural. Light was a luxury, and at Christmas, that luxury was distributed with greater generosity. You can hear echoes of this in our modern Christmas light decorations, but we have lost the original meaning. When light is available by the simple flick of a switch, decorative lights are pretty but not miraculous. For medieval people, extra light in deep winter was literally miraculous. Decoration with green vegetation, holly, ivy, mistletoe, evergreen branches, or fir had multiple layers of meaning. On the most practical level, bringing green plants inside during winter was an affirmation of continuing life when everything outside seemed dead. These plants persisted green through the barren season. They were literal symbols of resilience and hope. Medieval Christians interpreted them as reminders of the eternal life promised by Christ. But the origins of these traditions were far older. Celtic Druids venerated holly and ivy. Romans used evergreen plants in Saturnalia. Germanic peoples considered fir sacred. The Church Christianized these practices, but the pagan roots were never completely erased. Mistletoe deserves special mention because it reveals perfectly the tension between Christianization and pagan persistence. Mistletoe was sacred to the Druids, so sacred that it was harvested with golden sickles in elaborate rituals. It had associations with fertility, healing, and protection. The tradition of kissing under the mistletoe comes directly from these pagan associations with fertility. The medieval church was deeply ambivalent about mistletoe, some authorities banning it completely from churches while allowing it in private homes. But the practice persisted because people enjoyed it, because it connected them to ancestral traditions, because some beliefs are too resistant to die merely because new religions arrive. Is it not fascinating how we still hang mistletoe and kiss beneath it, completely disconnected from its original religious meaning, yet maintaining the ritual? Compare medieval Christmas spaces with modern ones. Our homes have central heating, a comfort we cannot underestimate. We have insulation, double-pane windows, thermostats that maintain constant temperature. We have electric lighting in every room, so abundant that we rarely think about it. Our Christmas decoration is largely purchased. Manufactured ornaments, LED lights, sometimes artificial trees. There is convenience in that, certainly, but there is also a disposable quality, a lack of effort and intention. No one spent months weaving their Christmas decorations. No one dragged an enormous log inside and assumed the sacred responsibility of keeping it burning. We did not go to the forest to gather green vegetation that symbolically represents the persistence of life through darkness. Did we lose something when we outsourced the creation of festive environments to mass manufacturing? When decoration becomes about buying the right set from the store, rather than creating with your own hands from natural materials, something changes. The connection between you and the space you inhabit becomes more tenuous. Medieval people, forced by necessity to create their own festive environments, had a more intimate relationship with their physical environment. They knew where each element came from, which forest, which tree, which craftsman. Their Christmas homes were personal authorship, not consumer curation. There is also something about temperature worth considering. We live in climate-controlled environments where the difference between inside and outside is minimized. Our bodies rarely experience true cold followed by genuine heat. But for medieval people, the contrast was extreme and constant. You came in from the biting cold outside, cold so intense it hurt, that made your fingers numb, that threatened your survival if you stayed exposed too long. And then you entered the heated space, and the relief, the physical pleasure of warmth penetrating your frozen limbs was intense, almost erotic. Medieval Christmas was about these contrasts: cold versus heat, darkness versus light, scarcity versus temporary abundance. Has our constant abundance robbed us of the ability to deeply appreciate these contrasts? Smaller spaces, or the homes of peasants and craftsmen, had their own Christmas decoration practices, although far more modest. It might be simply a few holly branches hung over the door, a single good candle saved for Christmas Eve, extra cleaning and tidying to mark the day as special. But the intention was the same: to transform common space into something sacred and festive. Even with minimal resources, the effort was made, and perhaps paradoxically, when you have fewer resources, each small decorative element means more. A single holly branch for a peasant family carried as much emotional and symbolic weight as elaborate tapestries in a castle. In churches, the spatial transformation was even more dramatic. Throughout the year, churches were relatively austere, severe beauty of stone and glass. But for Christmas, they became theatres of wonder. We have already mentioned candles, but there was also incense burning copiously, music filling the vaulted spaces with natural reverberation, nativity scenes enacted, perhaps even mystery plays, religious pieces dramatizing biblical stories. The church became a total immersive experience, engaging all senses simultaneously. It was the virtual reality of the medieval age, available technology used to create transformative experiences that transported participants beyond their mundane lives. As the fireplace fire continued burning, as candles slowly consumed themselves, as the hours of Christmas transformed into days, these carefully constructed spaces of warmth and light became containers for the memories being created. Years later, people would remember not merely the events, but the sensation and the warmth on cheeks near the fire, the smell of rosemary under their feet, the flickering golden light on stone walls. Memory is profoundly embodied, rooted in sensory experience. Medieval people, perhaps without consciously planning it, created environments perfectly designed to generate lasting and emotionally resonant memories. And these memories, shared through families and communities, became part of the cultural fabric that bound people together through time. But what actually held that fabric together was not merely the physical spaces or the rituals, it was the stories that were told within them. When the feast was ending, when drink had warmed spirits and loosened tongues, when the fireplace cast dancing shadows on the decorated walls, it was then that one of the most important parts of medieval Christmas began: storytelling. In an age before printing, before mass literacy, before any form of recorded media, stories were the primary technology for preserving culture, transmitting values, teaching lessons, and, crucially, entertaining. Christmas, with its long nights and its time freed from normal work, was the perfect moment for this ancestral ritual. And the stories told were not merely passing entertainment. They were the living memory of the community, renewed and revitalized with each telling. Professional minstrels, when available, were highly valued. These were not simply storytellers, they were multifunctional artists who combined narration with music, sometimes with acrobatics or simple magic. They traveled from court to court, from town to town, carrying with them vast repertoires of stories, Arthurian legends, chivalric romances, lives of saints, historical epics, fairy tales. A good minstrel could adapt his material for the audience, lengthening or shortening stories as needed, emphasizing different aspects depending on who was listening. For nobility, stories of chivalry and courtly love. For more common audiences, perhaps tales with more earthy humor and less courtly idealization. But it was not merely professionals who told stories. In peasant homes, in smaller halls, in taverns, common people were the guardians of oral tradition. Grandparents told grandchildren the same stories they had heard from their own grandparents, creating chains of transmission that extended back centuries. These stories were surprisingly stable in their central elements. Modern folklore researchers have traced specific fairy tales back more than 1,000 years, recognizing the same basic narrative structure across countless cultural and temporal variations. How was this possible without written recording? Through constant repetition, through memorable formulas, through community reinforcement where errors were corrected by others who knew the correct version. Christmas stories specifically tended toward predictable themes, narratives of Christ's birth, of course, told and retold with elaborate details that went far beyond the sparse biblical accounts. Legends of saints, Saint Nicholas was particularly popular, with stories of his miraculous generosity, resurrecting dead children, saving drowning sailors, providing dowries for poor maidens. These were not merely edifying, they were functional, teaching cultural values, modeling desired behavior, explaining why certain practices, such as giving gifts, were observed. Stories served as pedagogy for an illiterate population. But there were also darker, stranger stories, tales about what happened to those who violated Christmas taboos, working on holy days, refusing hospitality, being stingy when generosity was expected. These often involved supernatural punishments, workers who insisted on grinding grain on Christmas Day and discovered they were grinding blood instead of flour, misers who were visited by vengeful spirits, blasphemers who were dragged away by the wild hunt. These were warning stories, social control narrativized. They taught conformity through fear, reinforcing community norms not through written law, but through the imagined threat of cosmic retribution. There were also stories of Christmas miracles, accounts of divine intervention, often involving the poor or oppressed being miraculously helped. A beggar revealed as Christ in disguise, rewarding those who had been kind. Snow miraculously stopping to allow the faithful to reach Mass. Food multiplying to feed hungry crowds. These stories served a crucial psychological function. They offered hope to the desperate, suggested that cosmic justice existed even when earthly justice clearly did not, promised that the powerful did not have the final word. In a society as brutally hierarchical as medieval society, these compensatory fantasies were psychological necessities. Arthurian tales were particularly popular during Christmas. Many of the stories of King Arthur and his knights are explicitly set during Christmas celebrations at Camelot's court. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, for example, one of the great medieval English romances, begins with an elaborate New Year's feast when a mysterious Green Knight bursts into the hall with an impossible challenge. These stories allowed medieval audiences to imagine idealized versions of their own celebrations. More splendid feasts, nobler knights, more beautiful ladies, more thrilling adventures. It was escapist literature, not different from how modern Hollywood blockbusters allow us to imagine amplified versions of reality. Think about how we consume stories today versus how medieval people consumed them. We read books silently, alone. We watch films and TV in darkened rooms, often isolated even when physically with others. We consume content through screens mediated by technology. The act of hearing a story told by a living human, sitting in the same physical space, seeing their expressions and gestures, hearing their voice changing with different characters. It is a qualitatively different experience. It is more immediate, more communal, more performative. The storyteller can read the room, adjust the pace, respond to the audience's reactions. And the audience is not passive. They influence the performance through their responses, laughter, sighs, attention, or restlessness. There was also a participatory aspect we have lost. Many folk stories included refrains or repetitive sections where the audience was expected to join in. Call and response between storyteller and listeners. It was not entertainment you simply consumed, it was something you participated in. And that participation created social bonding. When everyone in the room sang together in the familiar refrain of a beloved story, they experienced a moment of synchrony, of collective identity. Modern neuroscientists have discovered that synchronized activities, singing together, dancing together, even simply swaying together to the same rhythm, create powerful feelings of social connection and trust. Medieval people did not know the science, but they knew the effect. Stories also served more practical functions. They transmitted information: which plants were poisonous, how to predict weather, signs that someone was ill, folk remedies that occasionally worked. This knowledge was embedded in narratives rather than listed as dry facts. Once upon a time, a girl ate yew berries and died horribly teaches what a botany manual might teach, but in a more memorable and emotionally impactful form. Stories were databases, encyclopedias encoded in narrative form, because narrative form is how human brains naturally store and retrieve information. There was controversy even in the Middle Ages about which stories were appropriate. The Church frequently worried that secular stories, especially those with magical elements or romance that were not sufficiently moralizing, were dangerous distractions from proper religious devotion. Some clergy preached against minstrels as servants of the devil, leading people to sin through frivolous entertainment. But these objections rarely gained much traction. People loved their stories too much to give them up. And pragmatically, the Church perceived that absolute prohibitions were impossible to enforce and could generate resentment. Better to Christianize what you could and tolerate the rest. Compare this to modern debates about appropriate media. We worry about violence in video games, sexual content on TV, misinformation online. Medieval people worried about pagan stories corrupting Christian souls. The technologies change, but anxieties about what narratives do to people, especially to young people, remain remarkably consistent. In both cases, there is truth and exaggeration. Stories really do shape values and behavior, but not in the simple and direct way that censors assume. People are more resilient and discriminating in their narrative consumption than they are given credit for. The best medieval Christmas stories did something crucial. They created a sense of historical continuity. When you heard about how your great-grandparents celebrated Christmas, when you heard legends that had been told for centuries, you were positioned within a temporal chain that extended before you and would continue after. In an age when individual life was short and often brutal, this continuity offered comfort. You were part of something larger than yourself, something that would persist. Your Christmas efforts this year were connected to the efforts of countless earlier generations and would feed the celebrations of future generations. It was immortality through participation in tradition. Do we have that today? Some families maintain strong Christmas traditions that are passed down, but for many modern Americans, Christmas is more about individual consumerism than about participation in ancestral traditions. When we buy manufactured decorations instead of creating our own, when we watch generic Christmas films instead of telling family stories, when our celebrations are dictated by commercial marketing instead of inherited custom, we lose that sense of historical continuity. We gain the freedom to do Christmas our way, but we lose that anchor in something larger and older than ourselves. As the stories continued late into the night, voices eventually growing hoarse, eyes beginning to grow heavy despite the effort to stay awake, something subtle but profound was happening. The people present were being woven together through shared narrative. They were creating collective memory. Years later, they would remember not merely the stories, but who told them, who laughed at which part, who fell asleep by the fireplace, the smell of wood smoke and rosemary, the feeling of a full stomach and satisfied mind. Medieval Christmas was participatory theatre, religious cult, sensory banquet, and narrative academy, all fused into an integrated experience. And holding it all together, shaping all of it, was something we rarely name directly, but which was present in every moment. The acute and constant awareness that all this warmth and light and abundance existed in direct defiance of the cold darkness outside, waiting patiently to reclaim its dominion. Until now, we have spoken much about feasts and celebrations, about warmth and light and abundance. But we need to be honest about something crucial. Everything we have described was profoundly unequal. Medieval Christmas was not a uniform experience. It was radically different depending on where you stood in the pitiless hierarchy of feudal society. To truly understand medieval Christmas, you need to understand not merely how the privileged celebrated, but how the vast majority, the peasants, the serfs, the urban poor, experienced this season. And you need to understand the complicated and often hypocritical dance between Christian charity and the maintenance of inequality that happened under the guise of Christmas generosity. Let us start with numbers to provide context. In medieval Europe, approximately 80 to 90% of the population were peasants, people who worked the land, who lived in simple huts, whose entire existence revolved around agricultural cycles. For these people, Christmas did not mean weeks of elaborate culinary preparation. It meant, if they were lucky, a day of rest from hard labor. Perhaps a slightly better meal than normal. Bread of slightly superior quality. Perhaps a small piece of salted meat they had saved. Perhaps a boiled egg. That was luxury for them. The exotic spices, the roasted swans, the spiced hippocras. All of that was completely inaccessible, belonging to a different world that existed alongside theirs, but which might as well have been on another planet. The church preached that Christmas was about humility, about God choosing to be born in a stable to poor parents, about the last being first in the kingdom of heaven. But in earthly practice, Christmas often dramatically reinforced existing hierarchies. When a feudal lord distributed Christmas gifts to his serfs, some bread, a bit of cloth, perhaps small coins, this was not disinterested charity. It was a public demonstration of patronage, a visual reminder of who had resources and who depended on the generosity of others. The serfs were expected to demonstrate elaborate gratitude, to publicly acknowledge their dependence and the Lord's kindness. It was theatre of power disguised as generosity. There was even a term for this, largesse, the ostentatious generosity of nobility. But largesse was never about alleviating poverty or challenging inequality. It was about demonstrating status through giving. The more you gave, the more wealth you demonstrated having. And crucially, you gave from above to below, never horizontally, and certainly never upward. The direction of giving reinforced the direction of power. Compare this to our modern philanthropy. Billionaires donating millions to causes of their choosing, receiving buildings named in their honor, tax benefits, public recognition. The technology has changed, but the social function of giving as a demonstration of status remains remarkably similar. But there were also more genuine forms of Christmas charity, often mediated by the church. Monasteries and churches traditionally opened their doors at Christmas to feed the poor. This was not symbolic. It was literally life-saving for many. Medieval winter meant real hunger for the vulnerable, widows, orphans, the elderly, the sick, anyone without family to sustain them or land to work. A hot meal at Christmas, provided from church funds, could be the difference between survival and death by starvation or exposure. The monks who served these meals often did so with genuine sincerity, believing they were serving Christ in the poor, following the biblical commandment to feed the hungry. But even this charity had complicated dimensions. Medieval theology taught that giving to the poor benefited the giver as much as the recipient, in fact, perhaps more. Giving alms was understood as accumulating treasures in heaven, as buying spiritual insurance against punishment in the afterlife. The rich could literally buy their way into heaven through sufficiently generous donations. This created a system where charity benefited the poor materially, yes, but also allowed the rich to feel virtuous without ever questioning the structures that created poverty in the first place. The seeds of inequality remained firmly planted. Charity merely treated the superficial symptoms. There were also ritualized role reversals during Christmas that we have already mentioned. The Lord of Misrule, the boy bishop. These allowed those of low rank to temporarily command. But think critically about this. These reversals were always temporary, always clearly delimited, always controlled. They never threatened the actual social order. In fact, they probably reinforced it. When you allow someone to play at being king for one day and then restore normal order the next day, you have not challenged royalty, you have made it more tolerable by offering a pressure valve. It is like holidays in oppressive jobs. They make the work bearable, they do not challenge its fundamental nature. The urban poor, a growing class as medieval cities expanded, faced particular challenges during Christmas. Unlike rural peasants, who at least had some connection to food production, urban workers depended on wages to buy food. If work stopped during Christmas, as it often did, wages stopped too. For those living on the edge of subsistence, even a few days without income could mean catastrophe. Some resorted to begging, which increased during the Christmas season precisely because holiday ideology emphasized charity. Others depended on informal networks of mutual aid, neighbors sharing with neighbors because everyone knew they could be in that position soon. There was also crime. Thefts increased during Christmas, fueled by a combination of desperate need and opportunity, homes of the wealthy full of food and valuable goods, increasing temptations. Medieval punishments for theft were severe: mutilation, branding, sometimes death. But hunger is a powerful motivator. There are records of people risking horrible punishments, stealing food during Christmas because their children were starving. And here is the brutal hypocrisy. A society that declared itself Christian, that celebrated the birth of someone who had said, "Feed the hungry," would mutilate a mother for stealing bread to feed her children. Think about our own modern Christmas inequalities, especially in the United States. We have families spending thousands of dollars on gifts, decorations, elaborate parties, and we have families depending on charity donations just to have any Christmas meal. We have relentless advertising creating consumer desires, and we have growing awareness that commercialized Christmas is environmentally unsustainable and spiritually empty. It is not so different, really. The specifics have changed: our technology, our scale, our economic systems. But the patterns of inequality, charity that does not challenge structures, celebration that masks suffering, remain persistently familiar. There were occasionally rebellions. Medieval history is sprinkled with peasant revolts, some occurring during or shortly after Christmas, sometimes explicitly motivated by resentment about inequalities that the celebrations made impossible to ignore. When you see your Lord feasting for days in impossible abundance while your own children have bellies swollen from hunger, while you work the land that produced that food, that contradiction becomes unbearable. Most of these rebellions were crushed brutally. But they happened repeatedly, suggesting that theatrical charity and ritualized role reversals were not always sufficient to contain legitimate resentment. The Church navigated these tensions by teaching patience and deferred reward. Suffer now, be rewarded in heaven. The rich have their earthly rewards but will face judgment. The parable of Lazarus and the rich man, the beggar who goes to heaven while the rich man goes to hell, was preached regularly. Did this provide comfort to the poor? Perhaps. But it also conveniently discouraged earthly challenge to the established order. Suffer quietly, do not rebel, trust in future cosmic justice rather than seek present earthly justice. It was, let us be frank, ideology that served the interests of the powerful while presenting itself as consolation for the powerless. But it would be too cynical to dismiss all medieval charity as hypocritical or all patience of the poor as false consciousness. Many people genuinely believed the theology they preached. Many wealthy people genuinely felt obligated to help the poor, even if their actions did not challenge structures. And many poor people found genuine comfort in religion, real meaning in Christmas celebrations, even when those celebrations were modest. People are complicated, systems are complex. You can have brutal exploitation and genuine moments of human connection existing simultaneously. You can have unjust structures and individuals within those structures acting with real compassion. History is rarely simple. What is undeniable is this: medieval Christmas forced the question of inequality in ways that normal life did not. It placed rich and poor in proximity, in churches, at charity distributions, in halls where servants served lords. It created expectations of generosity that, even when fulfilled inadequately, acknowledged mutual obligations. And it offered, at least in religious theory, a vision of an alternative kingdom where the last would be first, where the hungry would be fed, where justice would prevail. That vision was rarely realized in medieval practice, but the vision itself, kept alive through Christmas rituals and stories, was powerful. It planted seeds that eventually, over centuries, would contribute to challenges to the feudal order. As Christmas night advanced, as the wealthy finally retired to warm beds and the poor curled up in cold corners, as the contrast between those two worlds became sharper in the darkness, something was always present: the unanswered question about whether a society that declared itself a follower of Christ could really justify its brutal inequalities. Medieval Christmas did not resolve that contradiction, and it merely made it visible. And visibility eventually can lead to change. But before any change could happen, before medieval winter could give way to literal and metaphorical spring, there were still more days of celebration, more traditions, more layers of meaning to unpack. And perhaps most revealing of all, what happened when the Christmas season finally, inevitably, came to an end. All good things end. This universal truth was perhaps felt more acutely at medieval Christmas than in almost any other context. After 12 days of celebration, relative abundance, loosened social rules, and renewed hope, reality inevitably reasserted its dominion. Epiphany on January 6th marked the official end of the Christmas season, and with it came not merely the end of the feast, but the return to a world that was, in many respects, harsher and colder than the one left behind on December 25th. Because now they were entering the deep heart of winter, January and February, the months when stored food supplies began to run out, when the cold was most relentless, when spring still seemed impossibly distant. The process of dismantling Christmas was ritualized as carefully as the process of creating it. The decorations of green vegetation, holly, ivy, mistletoe, evergreen branches needed to be removed. But they could not simply be discarded casually. There were specific prescriptions about what to do with them. Some traditions required burning them, preferably in the same fireplace that had warmed the celebrations, transforming the physical symbols of Christmas into smoke and ash. The smoke, rising up the chimney, symbolically carried the spirit of Christmas back to the heavens, ending the special period. Other traditions buried the vegetation, returning it to the earth from which it came, completing a cycle. Leaving Christmas decorations after Epiphany was considered bad luck, and not merely vague bad luck, but specifically dangerous. It was believed that the benevolent spirits that had been invited during Christmas through the decorations could become malevolent if forced to stay beyond the appropriate time. The green plants that had represented life and hope could become omens of death and decay if kept too long. There were warning stories about houses that kept their Christmas holly into February and experienced disasters, illnesses, deaths of livestock, fires. True or not, these stories reinforced the importance of clearly marking the end of the special season, of not trying to artificially extend what had natural limits. The Yule log, that enormous log that had burned throughout all 12 days, was finally allowed to go out completely. But even its ashes had purpose. They were carefully collected and preserved, believed to have protective properties. Some scattered them in fields to ensure good harvests, a practice that had both practical efficacy, wood ash is fertilizer, and magical significance. Others kept the ashes in their homes as protection against lightning or fire. And crucially, a piece of the Yule log was always saved to start the fire of the next year's Yule log, creating literal continuity, flames from one Christmas lighting the flames of the next, a chain of fire connecting years and generations. The days immediately after Epiphany were often melancholic. After weeks of excitement and celebration, after eating better and working less, after music and stories and constant company, the return to normal routine was jarring. Agricultural work resumed, although there was relatively little to do in frozen fields. Animals still needed to be fed, milk still needed to be milked, delayed repairs needed to be addressed. The contrast between festive life and common life was severe, and it is hard to imagine that many people did not feel some version of what we might call post-holiday blues, that emotional deflation that comes when something special ends and normalcy resumes. But there was also, curiously, an element of relief. 12 days of celebration were exhausting. For those who had hosted, the financial and logistical strain was considerable. For servants who had worked extra hard to create elaborate feasts, there was real physical exhaustion. For everyone, the emotional intensity of prolonged celebration, the drinking, the elevated emotions, the inevitable family conflicts that extended gatherings often produce, eventually became wearing. The return to routine offered predictability, structure, a break from the effort of commemorating. It is not different from how many modern Americans feel secret relief when the holiday season finally ends, when they can return to normal lives without shopping pressures, mandatory family gatherings, and the exhausting performance of festive joy. Financially, the post-Christmas period was often difficult. Families had spent accumulated resources in food, drink, gifts, decorations. Now they faced the leanest months of the year with reduced provisions. For urban merchants who had extended credit during Christmas, January was time to collect debts. For those who owed, it was time for reckoning. Some families discovered they had overextended, that their Christmas generosity or indulgence had left insufficient resources to survive until spring. Debts created during Christmas could haunt families for months or years. In extreme cases, they could lead to debt servitude, to loss of land or tools, to long-term economic catastrophe. Compare this to the modern post-Christmas season in the United States. January is notoriously the month when credit card bills arrive, when realizations about overspending set in, when New Year's resolutions about financial moderation are made. Academics call January the long month because December paychecks are already gone, holiday bills arrive, and the next paycheck seems very far away. The technology has changed. Did we use credit cards instead of personal credit from merchants? But the pattern of unsustainable holiday spending followed by January difficulties remains persistently familiar across centuries. It seems humans consistently underestimate future costs when immersed in present celebration. There was also a psychological and spiritual dimension to the end of Christmas worth considering. During the 12 days, people had lived in a kind of special time, a period when the divine seemed closer, when miracles seemed more possible, when the normal harshness of existence was suspended. Returning to normal life meant returning to a world where God seemed more distant, where miracles did not happen, where suffering and injustice continued unchanged. For those with deep faith, this transition could be spiritually disorienting. They had experienced a glimpse of how the world could be warm, abundant, just, and now had to return to how it really was. The Church offered theological frameworks for navigating this transition. The liturgical, ordinary time that followed Epiphany was less about dramatic celebration and more about the slow and constant work of living a Christian life in the everyday world. There were lessons about perseverance, patience, faith amid difficulties. Jesus himself, the sermons reminded, had left the glory of heaven to live an ordinary human life of work and suffering. If God was willing to dwell in everyday, mundane existence, then there was dignity in it, meaning in it, even potential holiness in it. It was not comfort as viscerally satisfying as a Christmas feast, but it offered a framework for finding purpose in the long, monotonous months ahead. There was also, in some communities, one final burst of celebration before Christmas ended completely. Plough Day, the day when ploughs were brought to church to be blessed before the agricultural work of spring began. This usually occurred on the first Monday after Epiphany. There were processions, sometimes with young people, elaborately dressed, pulling a decorated plough through the streets, collecting money for the church or for themselves. It was a ritualized transition back to work, a way of marking the end of the feast and the beginning of the labor that would sustain life until the next Christmas. It transformed the return to work into ceremony rather than mere necessity, gave dignity to the resumption of routines. For medieval children, the end of Christmas probably had its own particular character. Children who had enjoyed extra attention, perhaps some rare sweets, stories and games, now returned to their normal responsibilities, which for medieval peasant children meant work, not school in the modern sense. By 5 or 6 years old, children were already contributing to household labor, caring for younger siblings, herding geese, picking stones from fields, spinning wool. Medieval childhood, for most, was not a protected period of play and education. It was preparation through work for the adult life of labor. Christmas offered a break, but the break ended. And then there was the growing awareness as January advanced of how much winter still remained. February was often the hardest month, when stored supplies were lowest, but spring planting was still not possible, when the cold seemed endless, when diseases, aggravated by poor nutrition and crowded rooms, claimed more lives. The elderly, the sick, the very young. Those who had survived until Christmas sometimes did not survive until spring. It was a time of attrition, of waiting, of enduring. And the memory of Christmas, those days of warmth and light and abundance, could both sustain people and make the present more unbearable by contrast. But here is something remarkable. Even as Christmas ended, even as people returned to the harshness of winter life, thoughts were already turning toward the next Christmas. Stories told during the celebration that had just ended would be remembered, perhaps adjusted slightly, stored for retelling the next year. Children who had been baptized at this Christmas would take their first steps by the next. Couples who had announced betrothals during the festive season would be marrying by the next winter. The next year's Yule log was already being identified. Which tree would be cut, how it would be dragged inside when the time came. Future Christmas was being planted even as present Christmas disappeared into memory. This future orientation was crucial for psychological survival. When the present is hard, the ability to imagine a different future, even if that future is merely the repetition of a temporarily better past, offers hope. Medieval Christmas created an annual cycle of anticipation, experience, and memory. You remembered last Christmas, lived the current Christmas, anticipated the next. This cycle gave structure to time, punctuation to the year, something to look forward to when everything else seemed hopeless. It was, in its own way, sophisticated psychological technology for making difficult lives bearable, for keeping people going when continuing seemed impossible. As the last ashes of the Yule log cooled, as the last Christmas carol faded from active memory, as life resumed its familiar but less joyful rhythms, something essential had been accomplished. For 12 days the community had gathered, rituals had been performed, stories had been told, faith had been renewed, hierarchies had been both reinforced and temporarily challenged. The divine had been touched, or at least pursued, and more fundamentally, people had survived to this point of winter, and now would have memories to sustain them through what remained of the cold, until spring finally, miraculously, came again. When we look at medieval Christmas from our modern perspective, separated by 7 or 8 centuries, transformative technology, and seismic cultural shifts, what do we really see? Do we see something completely foreign, belonging to a world so different from ours that we can barely comprehend it? Or do we see, through all the superficial differences, something persistently human? Impulses, needs, hopes that remain remarkably consistent even when their expressions change dramatically. The truth, as often happens, lies somewhere in between. Medieval Christmas was both profoundly different and strangely familiar, and understanding that tension tells us something important not merely about the past, but about ourselves. Let us start with what changed most obviously: technology and material comfort. We do not fear dying of cold during winter. Our central heating maintains constant temperatures with thermostat adjustment. We do not depend on giant fireplaces and burning logs continuously. We do not experience that visceral contrast between brutal cold outside and precious warmth inside. Our lighting is so abundant that light pollution obscures the stars. We do not know true darkness, do not depend on precious candles or firelight. Our food comes from global supply chains that function 12 months a year. We do not know real scarcity, do not preserve meat for winter, do not reserve precious spices for special occasions because they are always available at trivial prices. These changes are profound. They have fundamentally altered the texture of human experience. They have eliminated many of the contrasts between hunger and plenty, cold and warmth, darkness and light, that made medieval Christmas so intensely meaningful. When everything is constantly abundant, when we are always comfortable, when there is no real scarcity to overcome, celebration loses some of its power. We are no longer defying winter with our feast. We are simply commemorating without a real antagonist against which we are celebrating. Does this make our Christmas less meaningful? Not necessarily. But it makes it different, less contrasting, perhaps less urgent. But look deeper, beyond technology and material comfort, and surprisingly persistent patterns emerge. We still gather families during winter, even if we fly across continents to do it instead of walking through snowy fields. We still exchange gifts, although the gifts are purchased rather than handmade, and the exchange is more about affection than about reinforcing feudal hierarchy. We still decorate with green plants, Christmas trees, wreaths, garlands, although we often do not know why, disconnected from the original meanings about life, persisting through winter's death. We still tell stories, although through screens rather than around fireplaces. We still seek connection, meaning something beyond the everyday. The underlying psychological needs that medieval Christmas addressed, for community, for ritual, for meaning, for hope, for sensory pleasure, remain. We have merely changed how we try to meet them. And here is a provocative question. Are we really meeting them better? We have more material comfort, certainly. But do we have more genuine community connection? Do our Christmas rituals carry more profound meaning? Or have they become empty performances, gestures we make because it is what you do, without really understanding why? Does our Christmas leave us more hopeful, more connected, more renewed? Or does it leave us exhausted, in debt, and vaguely dissatisfied, wondering why we spent so much effort and money on something that did not deliver the deep satisfaction it implicitly promised? There is an interesting paradox. The wealthier our society has become materially, the more our Christmas celebration has become about material consumption. But also the more insistently we try to assert that it is not about the gifts, and the true meaning of Christmas lies in something else. This protest suggests awareness that something has been lost, that material abundance alone does not satisfy the deeper needs the holiday should address. Medieval people with their scarcity did not have this anxiety. They knew exactly why they were celebrating. They had survived to this point. They had food to eat. They had community to share it with. It was straightforward. Our abundance, paradoxically, made meaning more obscure. The religious dimension has also changed profoundly, especially in increasingly secular societies like parts of the United States. For medieval people, Christmas was inescapably religious. Even the most pagan practices existed within a cultural matrix dominated by Christianity. Today, many Americans celebrate Christmas with little or no religious observance. It has become cultural, secular, separated from its theological roots. Is this loss or adaptation? It depends on your perspective. For believers, it represents lamentable secularization of something sacred. For non-believers, it represents liberation from dogma, allowing universal humanistic aspects of celebration, generosity, family, joy, to persist without theological baggage. Both perspectives have merit. But consider what the religious dimension provided that secular celebration may struggle to replicate: a narrative of cosmic meaning. Medieval Christmas was not merely about a family or community, it was about the crucial moment in human history when the divine entered the mortal. It was about salvation, redemption, ultimate purpose. Remove the theology and you can still have pleasant celebration, but you have lost that anchor in transcendent meaning. Perhaps our cultural anxiety about the true meaning of Christmas reflects this loss. We are searching for something that gives weight, meaning, purpose to the celebration beyond mere tradition or consumption. But in a secular age, we are unsure where to find it. Community dynamics have also changed fundamentally. Medieval Christmas was necessarily communal. You could not celebrate alone. You depended on your community for everything. Today, especially in the United States with its emphasis on individualism, many people celebrate in small nuclear family units or even alone. We have gained privacy and autonomy, but we have lost that sense of being embedded in a larger social network, that experience of the entire community gathering, that reinforcement of collective identity. And for many, especially the elderly, isolated or marginalized, modern Christmas highlights their loneliness in ways that community-structured medieval Christmas could not. There is also the question of time. Medieval Christmas was 12 complete days plus weeks of preparation. It was an extended period of celebration, reflection, and renewal. Modern American Christmas is essentially one day, perhaps two if you count Christmas Eve, and then it is over. We return to work, to normal life almost immediately. The intensity is compressed, the meaning concentrated in a much shorter period. This makes it more efficient, more manageable within busy lives, but it also loses that extended and ritualistic quality, that sense of inhabiting a special time for long enough that it really penetrates, transforms, renews. Inequality remains, although its expressions have changed. We no longer have feudal lords distributing bread to grateful servants. But we have billionaires donating to charity while maintaining obscene wealth. We have toy drives for poor children that highlight precisely the poverty they do not address structurally. We have adopt-a-family programs that are kind but also paternalistic. Christmas charity still functions, as it did medievally, to make inequality slightly more bearable without fundamentally challenging it. And just as in the medieval period, this charity is real and helps real people, but it also perpetuates structures by providing pressure valves that reduce pressure for systemic change. Stories have changed in medium but not in function. Medieval people had minstrels and oral traditions. We have Christmas movies, TV specials, holiday books. Stories still teach cultural values, still create shared experiences, still link generations through repetition. It's a Wonderful Life, or A Christmas Carol, function for modern Americans as Arthurian legends or Lives of Saints functioned for medieval audiences, teaching lessons, creating shared references, reinforcing what the culture values. The media have changed dramatically. The social function remains remarkably consistent. And then there is the deeper nature of why we celebrate in winter. That has not changed. The winter solstice is still the shortest day of the year. The nights are still long and cold. Humans still feel something primal about darkness and cold, still yearn for light and warmth and connection during the darkest season. Our pre-Christian ancestors responded to these feelings with solstice festivals. Medieval people Christianized these responses. We have secularized and commercialized them. But the underlying impulse to create light in darkness, warmth in cold, connection amid isolation, hope when everything seems dormant, remains a universal human constant, crossing cultures and centuries. Perhaps then, the true legacy of medieval Christmas lies not in specific practices we preserve or lose. It lies in the recognition that humans need rituals of renewal, especially during difficult times. We need moments when we gather together, when we affirm our connections to one another, when we create beauty and abundance even temporarily, when we tell our stories and confirm our values, when we acknowledge both our vulnerabilities and our capacities to create meaning and joy despite those vulnerabilities. Medieval people did this through their Christmases. We attempt to do it through ours. The forms differ vastly. The underlying human need remains. As medieval winter finally began to loosen its grip, as the days imperceptibly lengthened, as the first signs of spring eventually appeared, green shoots pushing through frozen soil, birds returning, the sun rising slightly earlier each day, people looked back on the Christmas they had created and lived. They carried these memories forward, to sustain them, to teach them to their children, to replicate them when the next winter came. And so the cycle continued, generation after generation, century after century, until it reached us. Now we are the ones carrying the torch, modified but not extinguished. What will we do with this legacy? How will we honor the deep human needs that Christmas, in all its forms across time, has tried to address? Here is a question you may never have considered. Why do we still celebrate Christmas the way we do? Why in the 21st century, with all our technology and secularization, do we still decorate trees, still gather in winter, still feel something special about this time of year? The answer does not lie in shopping centers or commercials. It lies in those freezing mornings of 1320, in those medieval fireplaces, in those stories told in darkness. What do those medieval people, living lives so different from ours, still have to teach us about celebration, community, and the human spirit? Perhaps the most fundamental lesson is about the power of contrast. Medieval Christmas was so meaningful precisely because it contrasted so sharply with everyday life. Warmth was precious because cold was threatening. Light was miraculous because darkness was oppressive. Abundance was joyful because scarcity was constant. Celebration meant something because there was so much from which one was celebrating escape. We, in our society of constant abundance, climate-controlled comfort, and perpetual illumination, have lost many of these contrasts. And in losing them, perhaps we have made it harder to feel the depth of gratitude and joy that our ancestors felt. Not that we should romanticize the harshness of their lives, certainly not, but perhaps we could intentionally create more awareness of what we have, more appreciation for the extraordinary wealth of resources we treat as commonplace. There is also something profound about community that medieval Christmas understood intuitively. They knew, because their daily lives constantly reminded them, that survival was collective, not individual. You depended on your neighbors, on your extended family, on your broader community. And then Christmas was structured to reinforce those bonds, to repair breaks that had emerged during the year, to renew mutual commitments. Compared to that, our modern Christmas often seems atomized, fragmented into small, nuclear family cells or even individual celebration. We have gained privacy and autonomy, but have we lost something essential about belonging, about being ensnared in a web of mutual relations that both constrain and sustain? The rituals of medieval Christmas, the procession to church, the elevation of the host, the lighting of the Yule log, the distribution of gifts, the telling of stories around the fireplace. All of these were repeated year after year, generation after generation. There was comfort in that repetition, a sense of continuity with the past and connection to the future. You did what your grandparents had done, and your grandchildren would do the same. In our era of constant change, of relentless innovation, of traditions being questioned and discarded, have we lost some of that anchor in continuity? Our Christmas celebrations often seem recently invented, governed by commercial trends rather than inherited tradition. There is freedom in that, certainly. But there is also disorientation, a sense of being unrooted, of not being connected to something larger and older than ourselves. The spiritual dimension of medieval Christmas, whether through official Christianity or persistent pagan beliefs, provided a framework of cosmic meaning. The celebration was not merely about this family, this community, this year. It was about eternal patterns, light defeating darkness, life triumphing over death, hope persisting despite despair. They were grand narratives that positioned each individual within a much larger story. For those of us living in a more secular age, finding equivalent structures of meaning can be challenging. What makes our celebration meaningful beyond tradition or personal pleasure? What connects us to something transcendent? These are questions that medieval Christmas answered easily through religion, but that modern Christmas often leaves open, unresolved. And then there is the question of inequality. We saw how medieval Christmas was deeply divided, radically different experiences for rich versus poor, for lords versus servants. We saw how charity functioned to make inequality more tolerable without challenging it structurally. It would be comforting to think we have progressed beyond that. But have we? Our modern Christmas is still marked by profound divisions. We still have some celebrating with obscene extravagance, while others depend on charity just to have a meal. We still have Christmas donations that make donors feel virtuous but leave poverty structures intact. The specific mechanisms have changed, but the patterns remain persistently familiar. Perhaps the lesson is humility, recognizing that we are not as different or superior to our ancestors as we would like to think. But there is also wisdom in medieval pragmatism. They understood that perfection was impossible, that contradictions were inevitable, that you worked within the systems that existed while trying, incrementally, to make them more human. Medieval Christmas did not resolve inequality, but it created moments of human connection across class divides. It did not eliminate suffering, but it offered temporary relief and hope to continue. It did not transform society, but it made it more bearable. Perhaps there is wisdom in accepting incremental change, in valuing small acts of kindness and connection, in creating moments of beauty and meaning, even when larger structures remain problematic. It is not resignation, it is realism tempered with compassion. What strikes most when looking back across these centuries is fundamental human resilience. Those medieval people faced difficulties that most of us cannot really imagine. Cold that threatened life, real hunger, shocking infant mortality, diseases without effective treatment, constant violence, brutal social oppression. And yet they created beauty. They made music, told stories, laughed, danced, loved. They wove elaborate tapestries and carved glorious cathedrals. They invented traditions that would reach us across centuries. They persisted, not merely surviving, but finding ways to flourish, to create meaning, to celebrate life despite all its harshness. That is profoundly inspiring. If they could find joy and purpose in such difficult conditions, surely we, with all our material advantages, can too. If these stories of medieval Christmas have resonated with you, if you have found yourself thinking differently about tradition, community, and celebration, you belong here at Sleeping Times. This is not merely a community of listeners, it is a community of the curious, of people who understand that the past holds profound lessons for the present, of souls who find beauty in well-told stories. Subscribe to explore with us other moments in history that reveal timeless truths about human experience. We want to know what other historical periods awaken your curiosity. What lost traditions would you like to rediscover? What stories do you want us to explore together? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your voice shapes our collective journey. We are a community of time explorers, and there is so much still to discover together. Perhaps the simplest and most profound lesson is this: humans need to celebrate. We need moments when we gather together, when we create beauty, when we share abundance, even if modest, when we tell our stories, when we reaffirm our connections to one another and to something larger than ourselves. The specific forms that this celebration takes will change with technology, culture, religion, economy, but the underlying need remains constant. That is why Christmas has persisted, transforming across centuries, but never disappearing. That is why we still decorate trees and exchange gifts and gather with family and tell stories, even when we lose awareness of the origins of these practices. The bells that rang on that Christmas morning in 1320, calling the faithful across snow-covered fields to stone churches, still echo in a certain way. Not literally, of course. Those specific bells, those churches, those people are long gone. But what they represented, a call to community, to celebration, to renewal, to hope, still resonates. Every time we gather during winter, every time we create light in darkness, every time we share food and stories and presents with one another, we are answering the same call that moved our medieval ancestors. The specific responses have changed, the call remains. You are part of an unbroken chain of human celebration that extends back thousands of years. Countless generations before you faced winter, created rituals to defy it, found ways to create meaning and joy despite difficulty. You carry that legacy in your own celebrations, whether you consciously know it or not, and you will pass it on in some form to those who come after. There is something humbling and elevating in that. Being a link in such a long chain, being part of a story so old. You are not alone, neither in the present nor across time. You belong to something larger, and perhaps that belonging, that sense of connection across generations and centuries, is the most profound gift that Christmas, medieval, modern, or yet to come, can offer. As you rest now, carry with you this knowledge. You are part of something ancient, precious, and enduring. The same stars that shone over those snow-covered medieval fields shine over you tonight. The same cycle of darkness and light, cold and warmth, challenge and celebration continues. And you, in this moment, in this place, are writing your own chapter in that endless story. Sleep well, knowing that you belong to that magnificent narrative, knowing that your life, with all its celebrations and difficulties, is part of something much larger and more beautiful than any of us can see completely. Good night.